Hey everyone, welcome, welcome to um, welcome to week 2 in our course, Principles and Strategies for Church Revitalization. This is a little bit different this week. I'm actually pre-recording this lecture for you, and then I'm just going to ask that you engage with it just a little bit by answering a couple short questions on the discussion board that will count as interaction for the course this week for interacting with the lectures. I've just had a little conflict in my schedule for something that has come up today, and so having to pre-record this one. I have worked out a better solution for us for our meetings. Rather than using Google Meet moving forward, which in a little bit of research between last week and our first class and this week, I have learned that Microsoft Teams is what I should use. We also have that at the school, and so even though we got rid of Zoom, we still have Google Meet, but we also have Microsoft Teams. And so I've messed around with that and experimented with it some this week, and found out that Microsoft Teams is much better than Google Meet in allowing me to show presentations, interact with everyone. So I will be sending out Microsoft Teams invitations through our school account for that, and you should have access to it, and we'll be using that platform for our live classes moving forward. I also want to kind of make available a little bit of extra time, maybe before each class, and so I'm going to make it a point to try to log on about a half hour before each class. And so if you want to jump in, say at 1:30, and you have some questions or just things about the course or the content that you want to discuss, I'll be available then for that. And then I also am going to block out a couple other times where I'll just be available to log in and to meet, to just discuss the class, the DMIN program, really anything that you want to discuss, the church, ministry, just to try to make myself a little bit more available beyond just an hour and a half kind of, going through a bunch of slides, teaching content. So I kind of want to make myself available more than that so we can dialogue and discuss. And I may even create just a little bit of a calendar I can send out and allow you to look at some options there if you wanted to meet individually with me as well, and we can do that. But anyway, this is, again, sorry for the kind of change in schedule for this week, week 2, but I've just had something conflict with my schedule today that I've got to go to, and so anyway, I apologize for that. All right, so this is Tuesday morning for me, and I'm just recording some of this. We left off in our last session last week. We really were still dealing with week 1, assessing the church and evaluating their readiness for change. And I'm just going to kind of wrap that one up for us today through this lecture. And then we'll come next week and we'll jump into the preparation for re-envisioning the church, stage 1. So we'll be a little bit behind, but I know I can catch up when we get down to week 5 in particular. Okay, so we're dealing with assessing the church and evaluating their readiness to change. And remember, the whole concept here for a church and as a pastor is you're looking at revitalization. There needs to be change. If a church needs revitalization, it needs to change. It needs to experience change. If the church is plateaued or declining, something is unhealthy. Something needs to change. Unless you're in a rare situation where the community is declining and people are moving away and the church is kind of holding stable, maybe that church is a little healthier than just what a plateau would indicate. And again, remember, we went through some of the numbers, but I just want to remind you that it's not church size. The number of people that come to a church does not correlate with health. Just because a church has large numbers coming doesn't mean it's healthy. one church that I know of that runs over 1,300 on a given Sunday. They've been that way for a decade now. 60, 70 to 100 people join that church every year over the last 10 years, yet the church is not growing numerically. And so just because a church is large doesn't mean that it's growing. On the other hand, I mentioned to you about the church that I came into contact with at the Sin Network church planter training, where they're a church of about 250, but over the last 20 years, they have been a part of planting out of their church other churches that have also planted churches, and some of those churches have planted churches. And so about 20 churches now have been planted out of that church over the last 20 years, either as a child being planted out, we're parenting and we're planting out the church, or even grandchild church or great-grandchild church, as some of the churches they've planted have planted. And so even though that church, may look at it and say, well, there's 250, and even in that case, they may be 250 and plateaued, but they're multiplying. So they are growing. If you're just looking at annual average worship attendance, it may not even look like they're growing so much, but they are multiplying and they are sending. It's important to remember that seating capacity is not the greatest indicator of church health. It's not seating capacity, but sending capacity. Again, that's not original to me. Many have said that before, but the way that I like to think about it is we measure the health of our church not in terms of filling up a worship service as the finish line, or filling up a worship service, filling up a worship center, a sanctuary. Well, if we can fill that thing up for one service, for two services, for three services, then we will say we've finished it, we've crossed the finish line. No. Filling up the worship center is not the finish line. The finish line needs to be moved beyond that point to multiplying, seeing more churches planted or replanted. And I think that's something that we have to give consideration to. So we looked at different statistics, but these are the these are the areas of health that we should consider and assess in the church. And I would start here with these 9 areas: outreach, evangelism, assimilation, community analysis, prayer, preaching, finance, facilities, and leadership. And really, we left off in our last class with preaching. And so for this lecture, I'm going to deal with finances, facilities, leadership, and then just some talking points about change and how to lead and affect change as the pastor, as the leader in your church. All of these points, you could simply take these questions. You could add a few questions to it yourself, and you could assess the health and determine what needs to change in the church. I would also say a very good, let me back up for that for you, but I would say a very good strategy here would be in your church as the pastor. I would give it, I would probably personally give it a little bit of time. If you were new to a church, I would wait a little bit of time, maybe a year, to just build some trust and credibility and a little bit of faith in your leadership from the people before you do this. But you could early on do this, and I think it could be just because the freshness and the newness of you being there, if you're a new pastor, could help get honesty, and you could even be better at receiving the information if you're new, very fresh there, because you don't feel personally threatened by hearing bad things because you're new. Sometimes when we've pastored for a while, if we sit down and we get a group of people in the church together to really discuss things, and they start pointing out things to us that they do not assess to be very healthy, we can take that as a threat to our leadership. We can take that as kind of a like disapproval of something we have done, because we if we've been there for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's responsibility that we feel for the church being the way it is. But I would just encourage you, even if you've been at a church for a while, this would be a healthy thing to do periodically. When I was a youth pastor, we had about 5 areas of youth ministry that we once a year, myself with our adult leaders, we would literally grade and score. We would ask ourselves, hey, in this particular area of the ministry, evangelism was one of the ones. What are we doing to help our students? What are we doing as youth ministry to help our students share the gospel? Are we effectively doing anything to help the students share the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are we providing programs that bring kids here that we share the gospel? What are we doing that would fall under the category of evangelism? What are we doing that would fall under the category of discipleship, for example? That was another one we looked at in youth ministry. So we had about 5 areas. And that comes from purpose-driven church and the purpose-driven kind of youth ministry and all of that. We use those 5 kind of purposes to assess every year. And that was something, I did 10, 15 years ago in youth ministry. But every year we would sit down, we would look at those 5 areas with a group of youth leaders, adult youth leaders, and we'd say, how well are we doing? What are we doing that fits these categories? And then are we doing well at it? Or not. And we would grade it on a letter grade scale. And I think that can be something very effective to do at least periodically, once a year, every 2 or 3 years, every 5 years. But get a group together, some of your deacons, some of your elders or pastors, some other people in the church that are just very involved and attuned to what's going on. Get your group together and score this and average out. Maybe you want to do a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. I think 1 to 5 is probably a little bit better, just narrowing it in, or a letter grade, A, B, C, D, E, F, or, A, B, C, A, B, C, D, F, but look at it, have some conversations about what these things are, and then ask everyone to confidentially, score it, and then grade it, and then average out those grades and see what a group of 15 or 20 in your church may score in these areas. And then it will give you an awareness of particular areas where there's a lack of health. Because, and we'll talk about this some in a later lecture, but just like our physical body, our body has different systems to it, and we could be, our respiratory system could be very healthy, but our muscular or skeletal system could be deteriorating or struggling. And so, again, that speaks to what is unhealthy that needs attention, or our mental health could be struggling. Emotionally, our emotional health could be struggling. Physically, we could be good. There's just different ways of looking at the total overall health. And so these are the areas you would assess. Okay, when we come to finance, what is the weekly per capita giving? I believe pastors ought to take an active approach, a hands-on approach to the finances of the church, at least knowing, being aware of, seeing the trends, the statistics, knowing the metrics, and then taking those metrics and even preaching and teaching on healthy stewardship and finance in the church. I would say that has been, for me, it has been a little bit of a strength of mine. I'd naturally gravitate towards numbers and charts and looking at that and analyzing the data to see how healthy we are doing. That was something I did even as a youth pastor at the church I was at before. The pastor said, yeah, you can look at all of our numbers and metrics and figure out how well we're doing and share that stuff back. And so, every week I was looking at the average weekly offering or the average offering that came in that week. Are we making budget each week? Are we not? Are we growing? Is there a trajectory of growth in our church financially? And then I've done that as well pretty consistently here at Lebanon Baptist Church. So, one of the things you want to calculate is, and this is probably the best, most basic marker of financial health in a church, is what is the weekly per capita giving. Now, my slide here says, and I should have updated this, my slide says that $26 in general fund budgeted giving is considered healthy. Again, a number by Tom Rayner. That was 10 years ago. That number has been updated. I just reached out to my community that I belong to through Church Answers, and got involved there where there's thousands of pastors. That's something Tom and Sam, organize and run. And so the new kind of number or metric for healthy per capita giving is not 26, but it's 33. And so 33 is the new number to look at. There is a little more detailed breakdown that you can find if you do your research on that as well, but $33. So you want to switch that 26 out to 33. Now, how do you calculate per capita giving? Okay, here's what you do if you're not familiar with that, but you take your weekly worship attendance. So how many people are attending every week, counting your kids, your preschool, youth, everybody. So it's not excluding the nursery, include everybody. What does your church run in average weekly worship attendance? Okay, and then you will divide that. By the average weekly offering that's undesignated. So, what is your average weekly offering? Is it $10,000? Is it $5,000? What do you get in your weekly offerings that's not designated for something specific? So this would be just the money that's coming in general to fund your budget. Take that weekly number, take the weekly attendance number, and you divide. Okay, so for example, in our church, our average weekly is about $17,000 in giving, and our average worship attendance is $475, and so that's a 35.7. So our per capita giving right now, just for the first 2.5 months of the year, is 35.7, just above the healthy mark of 33 that Rainer encourages. Now, a lot of things influence that number. Okay, are you in an affluent community? Are you in a poorer community? Different things influence that, but generally speaking, you want to kind of look at that as a metric for financial health. $33 there a week is typical per person. But okay, what about the history of the church? Has it been plateaued, declining, or increasing? Was there more money given this week from last week, or not on a weekly basis? That fluctuates, and you have to learn to read some of that stuff. But over the years, has the giving plateaued, declined, or increased? If you've been a pastor at the church for say 10 years, go back and look. What was the giving each of those 10 years? And is there a graph and a chart and a trajectory? Is it moving? Can you draw a line that's moving upward, or is it staying the same, or is it decreasing? That's a good number, to look at. And I would say just because of inflation over these last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, just because of inflation, the giving should be going up, even if the church attendance is plateaued, because of giving a higher amount. Okay, so that's something very important to look at. And I would say, too, you've got to learn to read the seasons. Our giving is typically lower during the summer. That's the lowest kind of period of giving in our church is during the summer. Our second lowest period of giving, believe it or not, is the first kind of 2 months of the year, January and February. And maybe that's typical. It kind of picks back up and brings us kind of back to where we need to be in the spring, like around Easter and maybe tax time, But usually, when I look at our weekly giving after February, we are experiencing, on average, a $1,500 to $2,500 a week shortfall based upon what we need for our budget. But usually by the end of May, we are pretty close to being back to where we need to be in terms of our offerings for the year. And then by the time we come around to November and December, for our church, November, December is really high. But we emphasize it. During the last couple of months of the year, we emphasize giving 2 or 3 strategic times just for specific things and year-end giving and all of that. Okay, but another thing to look at, what amount of debt does the church carry? Um, the number that I have followed kind of as a benchmark is 2.5 times the annual income should be the maximum. So when we were considering going into a capital campaign about a year after I had been here at the church, and the church owed $1.3 million already on the Family Life Center, something that had been built about 8 years prior to my coming. So we got $1.3 million of debt. We had 600, our annual offerings at the time were about 650,000. So we already owed, 2 times. We were already in debt 2 times our annual budget, our annual income. So as we were looking at it and calculating a capital giving campaign to renovate our worship center, which cost $1.3 million, how can we do that? How can we take on $1.3 million when we already owe $1.3 million? That's going to push us up to $2.6 million, and our annual income was $650,000. And if you do 650,000 times 2.5, that's only 1.6. So it's like when we were looking at our budget and we were looking at everything, it's like we really can't, we can't borrow but $300,000 or we're going to put ourselves. So the way we did it was we asked and challenged everybody in the church, to make a commitment to fund above and beyond their offerings, to fund the vision, to fund the renovation over a 3-year period. We knew with a $1.3 million project, we needed a $1 million commitment to give, which meant if that $1 million was given over that 3-year period, then there would be 300,000 left, coupled with the 1.3 that we had would be 1.6, and we would be under, at the end of our capital giving campaign, we'd be under 2.5 times our annual income. Now, that would be if the annual giving did not increase over those 3 years, which it did. That would be if the giving did not exceed what was committed, which it did. And that would be if we only paid on the interest for our loan over those 3 years, which we didn't. We paid on the principal as well. So actually what happened was by the end of our 3-year capital giving campaign, in which after we launched the campaign, 6 months later, we moved out of the worship center and we did the work of the project. And then 6 months after that, we moved back in to the worship center. And then people continued to give for the vision of it over the remaining 2 years. Some even gave into the third, another year, which would have been 4 years. By the time the 3 years of the capital giving campaign was up, our general offerings had increased from like 650,000 to about 850,000. So that means now our maximum amount of debt to income has gone up quite a bit. So 2.5 times the 850,000. Now our maximum amount of debt we could have carried would have been 2.1 million. So the giving had increased in the general fund. The vision for the $1 million commitment had been funded. The $1 million had been committed. It had been funded even above that. So much so that 1.3 had been given over 3 years rather than just the 1 million that had been committed. And then people gave for a few months into that 4th year, and we paid the entire thing off completely. So at the end of 3 years, our debt from 1.3 had been brought down on the Family Life Center to 900,000, and the debt for the that was remaining left on the new renovation was down to 100,000, and so we had about a total of $1 million in debt at the end of that campaign, half of what would have been that maximum amount. So I don't know if that's helpful, but again, you can just look at, you would want to look at for a church in this case. Hey, you're going to a church, what is the debt that it has? When I was considering coming here as the pastor, a lot of the older people that I talked to as I was interviewing and some of the older deacons and those in leadership, they were fearful that no one would come here to the church, that a pastor would not want to come because the church had $1.3 million of debt. It had a $650,000 budget. It had 200 people. That's a lot of debt, they thought, for that amount of people. But what I knew was they were about 2 times the their annual income in debt, but not 2.5 times. So I knew they were on the higher end, but they did not exceed what would have been the maximum, and so I was comfortable with that. I would have been a little bit more hesitant to come here if the debt here would have been, say, $2 million for $650,000 of income. That would have been a little bit different because it would have been above that. But as you're considering this for the church, this is something to look at in terms of help. And then, the last question there, what percentage of the budget goes to key areas? I think looking at the budget tells you a lot about the church health and where the church values are, where they put their money, and just how those values maybe align or do not align with yours. Now, if you are the pastor and you've been there for some time, you need to look at this. So for me, one of the things that I led our church to do a few years ago was to take our budget and break our budget up, divide it up into these 5 different categories. And then all of the line items in our budget should fall under one of these 5 categories. And then what I look at, and what I encourage our church to look at, our finance team, our staff, our church, when we have our kind of church family sort of business meeting every year annually, is I want to present to them, hey, as a pastor, look, this percentage of our budget is going to personnel, and it's within that 40 to 60% range. This percentage of our budget is going to outreach and missions. This percentage is going to facilities and maintenance. This percentage is going to mortgage and debt reduction. This percentage is going to our educational or discipleship ministries. And those are kind of the healthy markers where we try to keep our budget percentages in those categories within balance. That is sort of a balanced budget in my perspective. One, are we budgeting money for the next year based upon our income this year? To me, it doesn't mean that our money we're budgeting for next year has to be limited to what we brought in this year. If we're on a growth trajectory, say we're averaging 4% growth in giving every year, you can forecast and project out a 4% growth next year, and your budget next year can be based upon that, taking that into account, so that you're actually budgeting more next year, okay, than what you brought in this year, but only based upon that growth trajectory if you have that. So, that's one way in which you can come up with your total number. But as we go through this process, I always think about and look at, okay, are we budgeting in line with our growth trajectory or not? So what is the total budget number for next year? And does it match up with what's reasonable, but also faith-filled? And then, is our budget balanced across these 5 categories? For us, I would say that our facilities and maintenance is a little bit high because of how much facilities we have here for our church and for our size, and because of the age of some of them. Our church has been around for 115 years, and even though we don't have the original building still here, we have the building that was built in 1955. We have the addition that I'm sitting in that was added in 1970. We have another building that was built in 1975. Our worship center that we meet in now was built in 1986, although we just spent $1.3 million in 2018. We spent that to renovate it, so it's fairly updated there in that respect. But we have the Family Life Center, the gym, and all of that, and so our facilities and maintenance is a little bit high. But what that means is it puts a little stress on some of the other areas that we have. But trying to keep it close to these numbers, I think, is healthy. I want to kind of exit this for just a second here, and sort of just show you. Let me just show you this, so maybe you can see some of these numbers here in my notes. But generally, the smaller the budget, the higher the percentage for staff. And so McIntosh points to this in his book, What Every Pastor Should Know. And so, usually if your budget is under $50,000, you may have as much as 89 or 90% going to staff. If your budget is between $50,000 to $100,000, you can come down to say maybe 56, 60% of your budget going to staff. and then 100 to 150 it goes down. So you kind of understand how those numbers work. For us, we are sort of in this range here for our budget. We're right at the $1 million mark, but these numbers tell you one thing, 40 to 60%, but the higher the budget, the less you can do, in that area. But generally, you kind of want to be in this realm. I have found that just teaching this stuff to our church and our finance team helps as we navigate through the process. But look at it. Where's the church? I mean, if you come into a church and as a new pastor and you're assessing or you're looking at it and you go, well, this church is giving, they're only giving 5% to outreach and missions. I mean, literally, only 5% is going to outreach and missions. Well, that would tell you something about the church's lack of value in that area. And then even in your educational ministries, I would encourage you to look at how is it being given to educational discipleship ministries? Youth, teens, kids, senior adults, Sunday school classes, life groups. What particular age group is there a higher amount going to one or the other? And that will help you understand some of the values there. We have, since I have been here, one of the major things we have done is we have disproportionately funded kids and youth ministry, both with the staff that we've hired for those areas, and then also with the percentage of discipleship ministry money that goes towards kids and goes towards youth. We have heavily emphasized that because we believe that if we value that financially, that will translate into growth and will, help the church grow for generations to come. And so we've done that. We've disproportionately funded kids and youth ministry. Okay, what about facilities? What's the overall condition of the church property? What is the condition of the nursery and kids areas? What do the restrooms look like? What does the main worship area look like? Where's the main entrance? Are there directional signs outside that are visible to guests? What about parking spaces? You really need one parking space for every 2 people is kind of the rule of thumb. How visible is the church? Is the church in a strategic location? Is there enough seating space? And so, facilities, you just take a walk around and look, but the longer you've been at the place, the more you've gotten used to it and accustomed. And so if you're a pastor and you've been at your church for, some time, 3+ years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, however long you've been there, you may not be seeing it any longer with fresh eyes. And so, when you first come to a church, you're walking around as pastor and you're seeing all kinds of things with the facility. You're like, this needs to change, and you get lost if there's not good signage and you've got a lot of buildings and stuff. But after some time, you become used to it. So if you've been there for a while, I would say, look, do you have any new members? Do you have any members that have joined in the last 6 months that are really kind of new? Sit down and meet with them. Take a facilities assessment and let them walk around and complete that with you. Bring in a secret shopper. Bring in someone to come look around and look at your facilities with you that has never been there and get their gut intuition about it. And just look at some of these metrics. When it comes to seating space, that's a really big one in the worship center. A room where you're meeting should not be much more than 80% full. Using 27 inches if you have pews, 27 inches per person. You could even go up to 30 if you're in a little bit more rural or suburban area. The further out of the city you get, the more space people kind of demand and require because they just like to have space, being that they're not in crowded places often. But rooms should not be more than 80% full. So that's real simple. If you have chairs, you count all the chairs and then you do 80% of that. But if you have pews, you got to measure the length of that, and 27 to 30 inches per person, and then 80%. Rooms should not be much less than 65% full. So in the worship center, ideally, when you meet for worship, the room should be between 65 to 80% full. That would be for optimal growth. McIntosh says that between 30 to 40% full is awkwardly empty. between 40 to 60 is comfortably empty. 60 to 80, comfortably full. That's ideal. 80 to 100 is uncomfortably full, and your potential for growth there is kind of low. So that's just some metrics to look at. I don't want to take too much more time. I've got to move through some of this. But then leadership. This is the last area I believe that we're looking at here in terms of assessing the church and what maybe needs to change. How many staff members does the church have? Is the church adequately staffed? So the church was running about 200 when I first came, and I was the only pastor. We had a part-time kids ministry leader that was paid to kind of show up on Sunday morning and Wednesday night and fulfill some responsibilities for the kids. But as far as pastor, I was the only pastor. A church should have one full-time pastor for every 150 people, every 120 to 150. That is McIntosh's metric. Several point to that, but the key though is to add the next pastoral staff member before it reaches the next 150 or 120. So what happens is many have become aware of this rule, and they've got 150 people in the church, and there's one pastor. And the church and the pastor basically concludes, hey, when we get to 300, or when we get to 240 or 250, when we get to that next number, then we'll add the other one. That's the opposite way of thinking that should go into this. In actuality, you won't get to that 240, 250, or 300 unless you add the other pastor. So once you have 150, you really have enough people that you should add a second. Now, I think churches that grow, especially in church plant situations, they already come in with two pastors, and a lot is being said for team leadership today, and a lot of healthy church plants get started with two pastors already from the very get-go. They may have a core group of 30 to 40 adults and two pastors already, because working hand in hand together is very good in terms of correlating to success. But if you're in an established church and it's 150 people and you're the only pastor, you really need to be looking at adding another one immediately. And then you got to determine, does this need to be like an administrative guy, an executive pastor? Does it need to be a youth pastor? Does it need to be a children's pastor? Does it need to be a worship pastor? Could it be a combination of that? What we hired here, I'd been here about a year, and we went through the process the last 6 months of that first year, determining and looking at and interviewing, and we hired a youth and worship pastor. Was kind of our second hire. It was sort of a combo position, youth and worship, because we had needs in both of those areas, and those two tended to have the potential to go together and to work together to be able to do that from a scheduling standpoint for the staff. And so that's what we did. But what positions, ministries does the church staff for the first? What do you staff for first when you're adding multiple pastors? Some argue today that the first position you really look to staff second with the pastor is more the administrative guy, because of all of the admin stuff that goes into that, the executive sort of administrative pastor. Some will argue worship. Some will argue kids. I think if I was a church of 120, I would probably look to hire a kids ministry pastor or leader first. That would probably be my first go-to today. But here, thankfully, right now we have on our staff with our size, we've got multiple, and we're looking right now. We're about to in the next month hire a youth pastor, because the one that we just had for 3.5 years transitioned to another church in Tennessee. I went to Seymour, First Baptist Church in Seymour. That's where he's at now. And so we're currently looking for another youth pastor. But we have someone in kids ministry, and our kids ministry director is also over all of our outreach ministries, which are heavily kids focused. And so that correlates really well. We have a worship pastor who does a lot of media and stuff for us, and we have an administrative pastor, and we will soon have a youth pastor. Again, actually, we'll be hiring from within. One of the great things for us here is just in the last 2 years, we have started being able to hire from within. And so that has been a great change because before that, all of our hires were from the outside, and now we are hiring from within. So our recreational ministries kind of outreach pastor and kids ministry pastor is hired from within. Our administrative operations manager, he has been hired from within. Our youth pastor that we're looking at, that we're about to hire, I believe we'll be hiring here soon. That is coming from within as well. And so that's just a great place to be. One other thing I would say on leadership on this slide, does the pastor lead the church? Who really leads the church? Is the pastor a servant leader or just a servant? When you look at the leadership of the church, one, do you have enough leaders? Do you have leaders in the right places? And then, is the pastor allowed to lead? In many churches, the churches will say they want a servant leader, but they really just want a servant. I know one church, I was talking with the pastor that was interviewing with them. It was a guy on staff with us, and he was kind of our number two, our associate pastor, and he was interviewing for a lead pastor at another church, and I was working with him on that. We had a good relationship. I knew that was the next thing for him, was to go be a lead pastor. He is a lead pastor now at a church, but not this one church. This one church he was interviewing with, and he'd preached for him, and he'd candidated kind of behind the scenes as far as like interviews and stuff with the committees. And one of the committees that kind of run the church said, basically said, we really just need you to preach, visit, do funerals, do weddings, kind of be a caretaking pastor and preach and teach, and we'll run the church. We've been running the church for the last 3 years. Well, when he came back and told me that, we worked through that. I said, don't go there. Like you don't want to go to a church where you are not leading the church as the shepherd leader. And so make sure you're allowed, the leaders, the pastors need to lead, set the vision, set the tone. What about the leadership structure? Who holds the ultimate decision-making power? Is it a lay board, deacon, elder? What's the tone or the posture of those meetings? One pastor I was talking to and advising a few years ago told me that basically the deacons kind of ran the church. And so in his case, he was given like 10 minutes. I said, what do your deacons' meetings look like? He said, well, the chairman leads the meeting, sets the agenda. I come to it. And then after about an hour and a half or 2 hours of talking about a broken faucet in the kid's wing that needs to be fixed and some paint that's peeling on the outside, after they go through all of these issues, or a couple people in the church have complained about a few things, after they work through all of those complaints and all those issues, 2 hours later, they'll say to him, all right, Pastor, now what do you have anything for us? And he usually has 10 or 15 minutes of stuff, and that's about it. And, I said, well, you're not really leading the group that's, leading the church. You need to figure out a way to lead that group. And in his case, it was more discerning as we talked through it to schedule another meeting with that same group that he called something very different, so that it wasn't like he's trying to all of a sudden just take over and run the meeting. Let those things be handled as they've been, but you put together a shepherd's meeting so that you can deal with the spiritual direction and tone of the church, and invite those deacons to come be a part of that and call it something different, and then help navigate leading that way. But sometimes our deacons really serve just as, and our leadership board kind of serve as lobbyists for interest groups within the congregation. That's a problem. Or are they working to pursue a unified vision? Does this group make ministry decisions or empower the professional ministry leaders to make the decisions? As the church grows and you have more elders, pastors, then those ones that are elders and pastors need to be setting the direction and need to be empowered. Even if you have a lay group, a church council, or a board of deacons, or an executive leadership board, even if you have a lay group that kind of helps provide oversight and accountability for your lead pastor or for your staff, Do they usurp and oversee their authority? Do they put their authority over, or do they empower those pastors and ministry, professionals, if you will? Do they empower them to lead and make decisions? That's a much better situation for health. And then, does that board or leadership team have an agreed upon covenant that they hold each other accountable to? That's an important question to look at for leadership. One thing that shouts, T.J. Addington said, one lesson that shouts from the pages in the history of God's people: when there was a faithful leader, God's people flourished. In the absence of godly empowered leadership, his people suffered. That comes from high impact church boards. If you're in a structure of church that has a deacon, a group of deacons that act as a board, or a church council that act as a board, if you're not in like a plurality of elders kind of structure, if you're in more of a vested authority in a lay group of people that the church votes on, I would really encourage you to read high impact church boards. It can really help you navigate and lead well within that model. Aubrey Malphur said the church is the hope of the world. Aubrey passed away, but he was my professor and guide, sort of mentor in my Doctor of Ministry degree. We did some teaching and lectures together, and anyway, he's written a lot. But Malphur's wrote, "The church is the hope of the world, but leadership is the hope of the church." Leadership matters, and so how healthy is the leadership of the church? That's so critical to its overall health. When it comes to church health, we got to make sure we get the right question. The wrong question is, how do I get my church to grow? The right question is, what is keeping it from growing? It's not about the numbers, it's about health. And healthy things grow. Ultimately, it's about lost people who matter to God. Are we reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ? And is the church growing? The question is, how do we get it to grow? See, God wants it to grow. He wants us to reach people. He wants the church to be healthy. So what is keeping it from growing is the real question. And I think you find the answer to that, and you approach it that way when you take these 9 areas of the ministry of the church and you start assessing and asking these questions to diagnose before you move to prognosis. I don't know if I said this when we met last, but just to explain that, prognosis without diagnosis is malpractice. And in the church, the same thing is true. When we come in and we prescribe something as a solution, but we haven't taken the time to really diagnose the problem, we are engaging in pastoral malpractice. So make sure you take time to diagnose before you prescribe. Kerry Newhoff, Kerry's very pragmatic. He's very practical. You can learn a lot from Kerry. If all you do is listen to him, I think you'll feel you might feel defeated at times and like you're inadequate, and just you may feel like too much is riding upon you and depending upon you. And that's why I do really like to balance reading stuff by Kerry Newhoff with reading stuff from the Reformed kind of group as well. And so if I'm reading some practical, pragmatic stuff from Kerry Newhoff and Tom Rainer and Sam Rainer, and then I'm also reading some stuff from John Piper and some stuff from Kevin DeYoung, and I'm reading some stuff from, even Mark Halleck. There's a good balance there that kind of brings me back. But anyway, I think it's important to balance those things. If we're only reading one camp or the other, I think we might be a little bit out of balance in our approach and view to ministry. But Newhoff has some good things to say, and I'll just run through these very quickly. But he wrote an article a few years back, 8 Reasons Most Churches Never Break the 200 Barrier, and I think this is just healthy. Again, not what do we do to get it growing, but these might be one of the reasons why it isn't, okay? The pastor is the primary caregiver. If you're the primary caregiver and, you're the first contact and point of contact and the one that everybody's depending upon to show up when someone's having surgery and all of that, it's going to be difficult to move beyond 200. The leaders lack a strategy. We have a church may have a clear mission, and it may have a clear dream even and vision of what it wants to accomplish, but then they haven't connected the dots. The leadership hasn't connected the dots of how we're going to accomplish that. There's no real strategy in place. True leaders aren't leading. You may not have the right people making the decisions. You may have some other group really leading the church, or you may have a matriarch or a patriarch in the church that holds a lot of power, and people go to them. And really, if they don't want something to happen, it won't happen. Well, then the true leader may not really be leading here. Volunteers are unempowered. Oftentimes we get to 200 by getting volunteers to do things, but we don't empower them to make decisions. They're constantly having to come back to us. Everything's still having to come across the desk of the pastor. They're just unempowered. The governance team micromanages. Too many meetings, too many events and programs that lead nowhere, and the pastor suffers from a desire to please everybody. My belief is that we try to keep we really have tried to limit our meetings. We usually have 1 to 2 church-wide family kind of business meetings a year. One is better than 2, but I do think at least 1 is good, an annual meeting where you're approving your budget and your leadership for the next year, and as far as your lay team with our structure. But too many meetings can be a problem. I know one church that they were about 40 people, and they were having a church business meeting every single month. Once a month, every month they had a church business meeting. They're 40 people, and the meetings were often there was often dissension in the meetings, and it was kind of caustic. People were expected to come to that. It's no wonder that the church kind of dwindled and people were not happy and the mood and the tone was negative. Another church I met with, they have 18 people. And the question we were asking, we're trying to help this church and help foster them back to health. And we were meeting with them, and they got 18 people, and we were trying to put together like a team to search for a pastor, because they had some money in the bank. They were willing to hire a pastor to come in, and we were going to try to resource that pastor and work with them. But in order for them to put together a search team for the pastor, there were like 3 different committees that had to meet and vote on that. So you had 3 different committees that had to meet, and every one of those committees had 2 or 3 people that were on the other committee. So it's like, why can't we just get all 3 of these committees together in one room? Well, no, they got to meet separately. And it was just a structure that was leading to nothing. And sometimes we have events and programs that really lead nowhere, but we think that we're doing something because we're busy. That can limit us. So these are some things to think through. Mark Twain said the only person who likes change is a baby with a wet diaper. And people don't like change. We don't like that. But if a church is in need of revitalization, change has to happen, or the inevitable is it will die. And then even more dramatic change will happen when a church ceases to exist in that community. And then the church becomes, an Italian restaurant. A church down not far from here, an hour and a half from here, where the pulpit used to sit, now is a bar for an Italian restaurant. Another church just 10 minutes from here is an Islamic school and mosque now, when it used to be a thriving Southern Baptist church just in the 80s and 90s. Now it's a mosque. Greater change is going to happen, but if we don't change, it's going to be even more dramatic. Even though we don't like it, we've got to help our people see that. Revitalization is the process by which the church learns to embrace the changes necessary to get it back on and keep it on a growth plane. The majority of churches in America are plateaued or dying for one of 2 reasons. They change what they should never change. So think about your mainline kind of Protestant liberal denominations. Even think about some of your Methodist denomination right now and the fracturing that's happening there. They change what they should never change, or, doctrine. That would be doctrine, theology, biblical truth. Or, in the case of many Baptist churches that are struggling and dying, they refuse to change what they are free to change. It's good statement. This is from Dale Burt, by the way, Leadership Journal. Dale was a professor of mine at Dallas, and Dale pastored the church in California, in Fullerton. He came in and took over as pastor following Chuck Swindoll when Chuck moved back to Texas. So he knows a thing or two about leadership and the need for change in a church, and he was following a giant, if you will. Attitude. Attitude is one of the keys to church revitalization. If the church has a bad attitude or a defeatist attitude, it may never see the potential it actually has. One of the things I've tried to teach our basketball players in basketball practice coaching over these years is you oftentimes try to get them to do something and they'll say, I can't do it. And what I want them to say is, no, say, I can't do it yet. That's a different attitude, one of hope. We've got to help our church see that they may be thinking they can't do it, when in reality it may be that they can't do it yet. But hey, we can work at this. We can build upon this. McIntosh and Arnn in their book, this is a book you ought to have. If you do not have it, I highly recommend you go out and order it. I've got it on Kindle as well as a hard copy. But I would highly encourage you to have this on your shelf. 101 Indispensable Rules of Thumb for Leading Your Church. It's maybe not a book you're going to sit down and read every page of from cover to cover. It's not very long, 250 pages or so, but it's a reference book. And so you go to issues on facilities, issues on finance, issues on leadership, issues on values and mission and vision. And there's a few rules of thumb that they give in there. Well, they've given some rules for change, very practical. How do you lead change? Well, find and work with the people who are more open to it. It's necessary for change to be for a vision for change to be shared, not just yours, but shared. And if it's going to be shared, you got to find and work with people who can embrace it, rather than focusing just on the few, maybe who won't be for it. Find some who are and work with them. Introduce change as a short-term experiment rather than a long-term commitment. Even when we were navigating that building renovation for our worship center and replacing of our heating and air and all of that, it was $1.3 million. I knew that was going to be hard for people to swallow. How could we possibly do this? And so we presented it as, hey, we're going to cast the vision for this. Here's what it's going to cost. Let's cast the vision. Let's call people to commit to it, and let's see what the commitments come in at. And if they're not there enough to fund it, we'll just back up and we'll have to re-envision what we're going to do. At the very beginning, we started out with, hey, we need to renovate the worship center. Okay, it needs to be renovated. But we don't know what it's going to cost. We don't know what it's going to look like. All we're asking for you to do is to appoint these individuals to serve as a team to go out and explore what needs to happen and to get all the information together and to come back to us with, here's what it's going to cost, here's what we want it to look like, and to make a presentation. See, these are just short-term experiments that you can get off at any point and go back. If you're wanting to start a second service and people are going, no, we don't want you to start a second service, that's going to be divisive and we don't think that's a good thing and it'll take too many people out of this one. And okay, rather than saying, no, we're doing it and bless God, we're going to do this no matter what, come hell or high water. No, you may say, hey, listen, can we try this for 6 months? I mean, you guys may be right. It may kill the momentum we have in this service. It may be, it may be difficult, but we really think it could be helpful in reaching more people and creating space so that we could grow in both services. And let's try it for 6 months and we'll come back and then see where we're at. And if it's not going well, we won't stick with it. People will embrace that kind of change a little more readily. Introduce new ideas as a way to reach an already agreed upon goal. That's a healthy thing to do. So look at something that the church already has agreed we want to do, and you say, this new thing we're trying helps us accomplish what we already have said we want to accomplish. Introduce a new idea as an addition, not necessarily a substitute. So that was something that a lot of churches did when they were starting a contemporary worship service. Those that were able to do that in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they were able to do it successfully in a very traditional church, was they introduced it as a new additional service that we're going to start, rather than, hey, we're going to change this traditional service and make those of you that have been worshiping and really connect and are able to worship God effectively through something you've been doing for 60 years, that all of you've got to change to now embrace a new form. Well, maybe you could present that as an addition. We're starting something here rather than switching it out. Another thing that we did was, rather than changing from a Sunday school model to, no more Sunday school, no more sitting in rows, everybody's going to be sitting in circles in smaller settings in a life group. You just create opportunities for life groups to be started in addition to already having Sunday school classes, and you just keep both of those going, so that the life group is not substituting and changing that. It's adding it as a new addition, and you're changing without replacing something. Sometimes you can more effectively navigate change that way. And then lastly, rather than presenting what needs to happen, it's good to help people see what's wrong and then ask for input on a solution. Oftentimes I will meet with our deacons and we'll approach issues this way. I may think in my mind I know what we need to do, but I want to come in with our leadership team and group and say, hey, here's some problems that I'm seeing. Do you guys see these problems? Okay. And what do you see? And let them speak into that, and then say, all right, how can we solve this? And let different ideas be shared. There have been many times where what I thought was the right way to fix that problem was usurped by a better way that emerged when I invited them into the process. And then we're arriving at a solution together, rather than just simply having that already pre-formulated. Anyway, those are very good. And that comes from McIntosh's book here, What Every Pastor Should Know. Those are 5 rules for change. Basically, Aubrey Malphurs framed the question when he would go in and do consulting, and he would look out and see a church that you could shoot a shotgun out through the sanctuary and probably wouldn't hit anybody because they were so spread out and they were mainly older. And he would teach and lead sessions with the church on trying to figure out what needs to change in order for the church to become healthy and growing again. And he always tried to make it really practical and personal. He would say, what would you be willing to change? You guys need to get in a room, lay out everything that you're doing as a church on one side. On the other side, under the question, what would we be willing? What of these things would we be willing to change in order to see your kids and grandkids sitting in the pew next to you? Would we change? Would we change from singing out of a hymn book to singing on a screen, if that meant? I'm not saying that means that their kids and grandkids would come, but if that meant they would come, would we change it? Would we read out of a different translation of the Bible, one that maybe would be a little bit more understandable to the next generation, if it meant that they would come? Would we be willing to do that? Those are questions that just could be explored and asked, and he would always frame it that way. I think, another maybe rule that you could add for change and how to help your church navigate change, when you look at all of these 9 areas of the church and you say, here are some that are very unhealthy that needs to change, and you begin to figure out what needs to change there, another very healthy tip for initiating change in a church is to communicate very clearly in that process, communicate very clearly what won't change. So if we're talking about changing a translation of the Bible that people have been comfortable with to a different one, how that could be a point of nervousness for many. So communicate we're not going to change, that we stand fully and firmly on the Scripture, that we teach the Scripture, that we hold to these doctrines, our statement of faith, our doctrinal statement, our beliefs, our values. These things will never change, but we do want to change the translation that we're using for greater clarity and easier communication in the services. For example, that would be an example. Okay, but this is helpful in thinking through how to lead change. Where's your church? Are they ready? Assess that. Prepare them. Lead them. And that begins by diagnosing where the problems are. Okay, thank you. Thank you for participating here in lecture, for this lecture, week 2. Just before you get off, just a reminder, be sure to go to the discussion forum for this week, for week 2. Go to the discussion forum and just answer a few questions there that will relate to this lesson. Thank you.